They beat her in the dust until she couldn't rise. The town watched. The law looked away. But one man, a stranger with blood on his past and a loaded Colt at his hip, stepped into that Texas street and changed everything. This is the story of Esther Rayner and Caleb Holt, a woman broken by lies, a man haunted by vengeance and the love that rose from violence and fire. Stay with me until the end and drop a comment with your city. I want to see how far this story travels across the world. The summer sun hung white and merciless over Sweetwater Creek, Texas, in the year of our Lord 1873. Dust rose in pale ghosts from the unpaved main street, swirling around the boots of men who had forgotten what mercy looked like. And in the center of that street, beneath the unblinking eye of heaven, they beat a woman until she could no longer stand. Her name was Esther Rayner. She was 24 years old, rail-thin from months of hunger, with dark hair matted to her face and a calico dress torn at the shoulder. Her hands were bound behind her back with hemp rope that had already rubbed her wrists raw and bleeding. She had committed no crime, but in a town like Sweetwater Creek, where power spoke louder than truth, innocence was a luxury the poor could not afford. "Thief!" shouted Marcus Finch, a thick-necked man with a badge that meant nothing and a temper that meant everything. He stood 6 feet tall in his boots with a gut that strained against his vest and canals scarred from years of violence. "You stole from Mr. Gaines, and by God you'll answer for it." Esther tried to speak, but the words came out in broken gasps. "I didn't. I never—" The second blow came from the side, a fist to her ribs that drove the air from her lungs. She crumpled forward, held upright only by the grip of the third man, a wiry ranch hand named Cully, who smiled as he yanked her back to her feet. "She's lying," Cully said, his breath reeking of whiskey and tobacco. "Found the brooch in her bag myself, saw it with my own eyes." That was the lie that had sealed her fate. A silver brooch, expensive, ornate, the kind of thing a saloon owner's mistress might wear, had been discovered in Esther's carpetbag that morning when she'd tried to board the stage out of town. She'd never seen it before in her life. Someone had planted it there. Someone with the power to make sure she paid for a crime she didn't commit. That someone was Luther Gaines. Gaines owned the Red Stallion Saloon, the largest building in Sweetwater Creek, and with it came ownership of half the town's business and most of its fear. He was a man of average height, but outsized ambition with slicked back hair and a smile that never reached his eyes. He'd propositioned Esther 3 times in the past month, offered her work upstairs in the saloon, promised her a warm bed and full meals if she'd just be reasonable. She'd refused him each time. This was his answer. Marcus Finch grabbed her by the hair and jerked her head back. "Mr. Gaines is a respected businessman," he snarled. "You think you can steal from him and just walk away?" "I didn't steal anything." Esther's voice cracked, desperation clawing at her throat. "Please, you have to believe me." The third punch caught her in the stomach, doubling her over. She tasted copper and dust. Her vision swam. Through the haze, she could see faces, townspeople watching from doorways and windows, some curious, some ashamed, all silent. No one would help her. No one dared. "String her up," someone muttered from the crowd. "Nah." Cully laughed. "Just beat some sense into her. Women like this need to learn their place." Finch released her hair, and Esther collapsed to her knees in the dirt. Her bound hands made it impossible to catch herself. She fell forward, her cheek striking the ground hard enough to split the skin. Blood trickled warm down her jaw. She tried to stand. Her legs wouldn't hold her. "Get up," Finch ordered. She couldn't. "I said get up." He kicked her in the side once, twice, and Esther curled into herself, trying to protect her ribs, her stomach, anything vital. The world had narrowed to pain and dust, and the terrible certainty that she was going to die here, beaten to death in the street while decent people watched and did nothing. And then a voice cut through the chaos like a rifle shot. "Step away from her." The beating stopped. Esther couldn't see him at first. Her vision was too blurred, her position too low, but she heard the sudden silence that fell over the street, the kind of silence that comes when death walks into a room and everyone knows it. "Who the hell are you?" Finch demanded. "Someone who's had enough." Esther forced her head up, squinting through blood and sweat. A man stood 15 feet away, tall and broad-shouldered, dressed in dusty trail clothes and a wide-brimmed hat pulled low over his face. A gun belt hung at his hips, the holster tied down in the way of men who knew how to use what they carried. His hand hovered near the grip of his Colt revolver, not touching it, not yet. But the threat was clear. "This ain't your business, stranger," Cully said, his voice uncertain now. "I'm making it my business." The stranger took a step forward. He moved with the controlled grace of a predator, every motion deliberate, economical. When he finally lifted his head enough for Esther to see his face, she caught her breath despite the pain. He was perhaps 30 years old, with a strong jaw shadowed by several days' worth of beard, and eyes the color of storm clouds, gray and hard and unreadable. There was something in those eyes that spoke of violence endured, and violence given of long roads and longer nights of a man who had walked through hell and come out the other side carrying all its scars. His name was Caleb Holt, though Esther didn't know that yet. "You deaf?" Finch growled, his hand dropping to his own gun. "I said walk away." "And I said step away from her." Caleb's voice was quiet level, but it carried the weight of absolute certainty. "I won't ask again." For a long, breathless moment, the street hung suspended between peace and gunfire. Esther could hear her own heartbeat thundering in her ears, could feel the grit of dirt between her teeth. 3 armed men against 1. The math was simple. The outcome seemed inevitable. And then Caleb's hand moved. He didn't draw, not yet. He simply rested his palm on the grip of his Colt thumb, brushing the hammer, and in that small gesture communicated everything that needed to be said. This was a man who had killed before. This was a man who would kill again if pushed. This was a man who did not bluff. Finch saw it. Cully saw it. Even Marcus Finch, drunk on power and Luther Gaines money, saw it. "Hell with this," Cully muttered, taking a step back. "Ain't worth dying over." "You yellow-bellied Finch started, but Cully was already backing toward the boardwalk, hands raised. The third man, a scarred brute named Polk, glanced between Caleb and Finch, calculation flickering in his dull eyes. "Finch," he said slowly, "maybe we should—" "Shut up!" Finch's face had gone red, rage and humiliation warring in his expression, but his hand moved away from his gun. "This ain't over," he spat at Caleb. "Not by a long shot." "Then come back when you're ready to finish it," Caleb said flatly. "But leave her out of it." Finch opened his mouth, closed it, then turned and stalked toward the Red Stallion saloon, his boots kicking up angry clouds of dust. Polk followed, casting one last uncertain look over his shoulder. Cully had already disappeared, and just like that, it was over. The street remained silent. No cheers, no applause, no gratitude from the watching townspeople. They simply retreated back into their shops and homes, pretending they had never witnessed anything at all. Cowardice was easier when you could convince yourself you'd never had a choice. Caleb waited until the 3 men were out of sight before he moved. Then he crossed the distance to Esther in 3 long strides, knelt in the dust beside her, and gently rolled her onto her back. "Easy now," he murmured. "I've got you." Esther tried to speak, but her throat was too dry, her voice too broken. She could only stare up at him through vision that swam and blurred, trying to understand why this stranger had risked his life for someone he'd never met. Caleb's hands were surprisingly gentle as he examined her injuries. His fingers brushed along her ribs, checking for breaks, then moved to the rope binding her wrists. He pulled a knife from his belt, a wicked-looking blade with a bone handle, and sliced through the hemp in one smooth motion. Blood rushed back into Esther's hands, bringing with it a wave of agony that made her gasp. "I know," Caleb said quietly. "I know it hurts, but you're going to be all right." He sheathed the knife and slipped one arm beneath her shoulders, the other under her knees. "I'm going to lift you now," he warned. "Try not to fight me." Esther managed the smallest nod. Caleb stood in one fluid motion, cradling her against his chest as though she weighed nothing at all. She was a small woman, made smaller by months of poor meals and hard living, but still the easy strength in his arms spoke of years spent working with his body. Years that had carved him into something both dangerous and capable. "Can you stand?" he asked, his voice low enough that only she could hear. Esther tried. She truly did. She pushed against his chest, willing her legs to hold her weight, her feet to find purchase on the dusty ground. But her body had been pushed beyond its limits. Her knees buckled. She would have fallen if Caleb hadn't tightened his grip. "That's all right," he said, and there was something achingly kind in those words, something that made Esther's throat close with sudden emotion. "You'll stand with me." He carried her to his horse, a big bay gelding with intelligent eyes and a patient temperament. The animal stood ground-tied in front of the general store, its reins hanging loose, trained well enough not to wander. Caleb shifted Esther's weight to one arm, while he gathered the reins with his free hand, then swung up into the saddle with her still held against him. "Where—" Esther's voice came out as barely more than a whisper. "Where are you taking me?" "Away from here," Caleb said simply. He settled her more comfortably across his lap, her head resting against his shoulder. "My ranch is about an hour's ride west. You'll be safe there." You don't know me." "No, ma'am, I don't." He nudged the bay into a walk, guiding them down the main street and away from Sweetwater Creek. "But I know what I saw. And I know that whatever they accused you of, you didn't deserve what they did." Esther closed her eyes, exhaustion crashing over her like a wave. She should have been frightened she was alone with a strange man, injured, helpless, riding away from the only town she knew. But something in Caleb's steady presence and the calm certainty of his words made fear impossible. Or perhaps she was simply too tired to be afraid anymore. "My name," she whispered, "is Esther Rayner." Caleb Holt. He glanced down at her, and for just a moment something that might have been a smile touched the corner of his mouth. "Pleased to meet you, Miss Rayner, though I wish it had been under better circumstances." Behind them, Sweetwater Creek receded into the distance, its false-fronted buildings and corrupt lawmen and watching windows growing smaller with each step of the bay's steady hooves. Ahead lay open country rolling hills, covered in scrub grass and mesquite, cut through by dry creek beds that would run full and wild when the rains finally came. The sky stretched vast and blue overhead, marked only by a few high clouds, and the lazy circle of a hawk searching for prey. Esther let herself drift, awareness fading in and out as her body tried to process the trauma it had endured. Sometimes she was conscious of Caleb's arms around her, solid and secure. Sometimes she felt the rhythmic movement of the horse beneath them. Once she thought she heard Caleb speaking to her low, steady words, meant to keep her anchored to consciousness, but she couldn't make out what he was saying. When she finally surfaced again, the sun had moved several hours across the sky. They were following a narrow trail through a landscape of red rock and twisted juniper. Ahead, she could see a break in the hills where a small valley opened up green with cottonwood trees that spoke of water. "Almost there," Caleb said, feeling her stir. "How are you holding up?" Esther tested her body carefully. Everything hurt: ribs, face, wrists, back, but the sharp edge of panic had dulled into something more manageable. "I've been better," she admitted. "I imagined so." The trail descended into the valley, and Esther saw Caleb's ranch for the first time. It was modest but well-maintained, a one-story house built of adobe and rough-cut timber, a barn with a hayloft and sturdy doors, several outbuildings, including what looked like a smokehouse and a root cellar. A corral held 4 horses, and she could see a small herd of cattle grazing in the pasture beyond. A vegetable garden grew near the house, its neat rows evidence of care and attention. It was, Esther realized, the kind of place someone could build a life. Caleb guided the bay to the front of the house and dismounted in one smooth motion, then reached up to lift Esther down. This time, when her feet touched the ground, she managed to stay upright for almost 3 seconds before her legs gave out. Caleb caught her easily. "Stubborn?" he observed, but there was approval in his tone. "I don't want to be a burden," Esther said through gritted teeth. "Then you'll rest until you're strong enough not to be." He carried her up the 3 steps to the covered porch and pushed the door open with his shoulder. The interior of the house was simple but clean. One large main room served as kitchen, dining area, and parlor, with a stone fireplace dominating one wall and a sturdy table surrounded by handmade chairs in the center. Doors led off to what Esther assumed were bedrooms. Everything was built for function rather than beauty, but there was a care to it, the way the curtains had been hung straight, the way the dishes were stacked neat and orderly, the way every tool had its place. Caleb carried her to a door on the left side of the house and shouldered it open. Inside was a small bedroom with a narrow bed covered in a simple quilt, a washstand with a ceramic basin and pitcher, and a window that looked out toward the mountains. Sunlight streamed through the clean glass, warming the wooden floor. "This is my sister's room," Caleb said quietly, settling Esther onto the bed. was my sister's room. Something in his voice, a tightness, a barely controlled grief, made Esther look up at him sharply, but his expression had gone carefully neutral, showing nothing. "I'm sorry," she said, understanding, without being told that his sister was gone. "So am I." Caleb straightened, putting distance between them. "I'll heat some water so you can wash up. Then I'll take a look at those injuries properly. After that, you'll eat and rest. No arguments." "I don't have any money," Esther said, shame coloring her cheeks. "I can't pay you for—" "I'm not asking for payment." Caleb moved to the door, then paused his hand on the frame. "When you're strong enough, if you want to work to earn your keep, we'll talk about it. Until then, just focus on healing." "Understood." Esther nodded, too overwhelmed to speak. After he left, she lay back against the pillows and stared at the ceiling, trying to make sense of the last few hours. This morning, she'd been beaten in the street, certain she was going to die. Now she was in a stranger's home, in his dead sister's bed, being offered sanctuary without conditions or expectations. It didn't make sense. People didn't do this, not in Esther's experience. People used you, hurt. You took what they wanted and discarded what remained. That was how the world worked. That was the lesson she'd learned over and over in her 24 years of hard living. But Caleb Holt had risked his life to save her, had carried her to safety, had offered her shelter and care without demanding anything in return. Who was this man, and what demons drove him to play the hero for a woman he'd never met? True to his word, Caleb returned 15 minutes later with a basin of warm water, clean cloths, and a battered medical kit that had seen considerable use. He set everything on the washstand, then pulled the room's single chair over to the bedside and sat down. "I need to examine your injuries," he said, his tone professional, almost clinical. "If you're not comfortable with that, I can ride to Bridgeport. That's the next town over, about 3 hours north, and bring back their doctor. But it'll be morning before we could get back here." Esther thought about spending the night in pain, waiting for help that might not come. She thought about the careful gentleness in Caleb's hands when he'd freed her from the ropes. She thought about the way he'd looked away when she'd been vulnerable in the street, giving her what dignity he could. "You can do it," she said. Caleb nodded. He moved with methodical efficiency, wetting a cloth and carefully cleaning the blood from her face. His touch was light, professional, but Esther still winced when he probed the swelling along her cheekbone. "Not broken," he said after a moment, "but you're going to have a hell of a bruise." He worked his way down, checking her split lip, examining her throat for damage, pressing gently along her ribs while asking her to breathe deeply and tell him where it hurt worst. 3 ribs were bruised, possibly cracked, but nothing seemed broken. Her wrists were in the worst shape, raw and bleeding from the ropes, and Caleb spent long minutes cleaning and bandaging them with a skill that spoke of hard-won experience. "You've done this before," Esther observed, watching him work. "More times than I care to remember." He tied off the bandage and sat back. "I was a scout for the Army during the last years of the Indian campaigns. Saw plenty of injuries. Learned to patch up what I could. And after—" his expression closed off. "After I did other work." The tone of his voice made it clear the subject was not open for discussion. Esther let it drop. When he finished the examination, Caleb fetched a clean nightgown from a trunk at the foot of the bed, more evidence of his sister's presence, and set it on the quilt. "I'll leave you to change and get some rest. When you wake up, I'll have food ready." "Caleb," Esther caught his sleeve as he turned to go. "Why did you help me?" He looked down at where her bandaged hand gripped his shirt, then met her eyes. For a long moment, he didn't answer. Then he said simply, "Because no one helped her." Before Esther could ask who "her" was, Caleb was gone, the door closing softly behind him. Esther slept, and in her sleep she dreamed. She dreamed of Sweetwater Creek, of dust and blood, and the sound of fists striking flesh. She dreamed of Marcus Finch's face red with rage, and Luther Gaines watching from the saloon window with cold satisfaction. She dreamed of falling, of trying to stand, and failing, of the terrible certainty that no help would come. And then the dream shifted. Strong arms lifted her. A voice promised safety. Gray eyes looked down at her with something that wasn't pity, but wasn't indifference either. Something harder to name, something that felt like recognition. Like he was seeing someone else when he looked at her, someone he'd failed to save. Because no one helped her. Esther woke with a start, her heart racing. The room was darker now, early evening, judging by the slant of light through the window. Her body ached with a deep, bone-weary pain, but the sharp panic had faded. She was safe. For now, at least, she was safe. Slowly, carefully, she pushed herself upright. The room spun slightly, and she had to wait for her vision to clear before attempting to stand. When she finally managed to get to her feet, she took a moment to steady herself against the bedpost, then made her way to the window. The view showed the western pasture and the mountains beyond their peaks glowing amber in the sunset. It was beautiful in a harsh, unforgiving way, the kind of beauty that demanded strength from those who lived in it. Esther had grown up in places like this, had learned young that survival meant adaptability and that softness was a luxury no one could afford. But here in this small ranch house, with this strange and dangerous man, she felt something she hadn't felt in years. She felt hope. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. "Miss Rayner?" Caleb's voice, respectful, careful. "I've got food if you're up to eating." "Come in," Esther called. Caleb entered carrying a tray with a bowl of stew, fresh bread, and a cup of water. The smell alone made Esther's stomach clench with hunger. She couldn't remember the last time she'd eaten a proper meal. "Figured you'd be hungry," he said, setting the tray on the small table by the window. "It's just venison stew, nothing fancy, but it's hot and filling." "It smells like heaven," Esther said honestly. She made her way to the chair, moving slowly, aware of Caleb watching her with assessing eyes. He didn't offer to help, and she was grateful for that, for the respect implicit in letting her manage on her own. The first bite of stew was everything she'd hoped for, rich and savory, with chunks of tender meat and vegetables in a thick broth. She ate slowly, savoring each mouthful, aware that her stomach would rebel if she rushed after going so long without food. Caleb leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed silent. After a few minutes, Esther glanced up at him. "Aren't you going to eat?" "Already did, just wanted to make sure you could manage." "I can manage." She tore off a piece of bread, using it to soak up the broth. "Though I appreciate the concern." "You handled yourself well back there," Caleb said. "In town. Most people would have broken." "I've had practice." The words came out more bitter than she'd intended. Esther set down her spoon and met his eyes. "You asked why I was in Sweetwater Creek. Do you want the whole story?" "Only if you want to tell it." So she did. She told him about growing up in St. Louis, about her father's drinking and her mother's death when Esther was 12, about working in factories and laundries to keep food on the table while her father gambled away what little they had, about the night he'd struck her during one of his drunken rages, and how she'd finally left at 17 with nothing but a carpet bag and determination. She told him about the years of drifting, working whatever jobs she could find, seamstress, cook, housemaid, moving from town to town whenever the work dried up or the men got too familiar. About arriving in Sweetwater Creek 3 months ago, desperate and nearly broke, taking a job cleaning rooms at the boarding house for barely enough to cover rent and meals. And she told him about Luther Gaines. "He owns half the town," she said quietly. "The saloon, the boarding house where I worked, even has the sheriff in his pocket. First time he propositioned me, I thought I could just refuse politely, and he'd leave me alone. Second time, he got angry. Third time," she touched her bruised cheek. "Third time, he told me I'd regret it. So he planted the brooch," Caleb said. "Wasn't a question. Must have. I never stole anything in my life." Esther's voice hardened. "But who'd believe a drifter with no family and no prospects over a respected businessman?" "No one," Caleb said flatly. "That's how men like Gaines operate. They know the law protects property and power, not people. You sound like you've met men like him before." "Too many," Caleb pushed away from the doorframe. "Finish your meal, then get some more rest. Tomorrow we'll talk about what comes next." "What if they come looking for me?" Esther asked, voicing the fear that had been gnawing at her since they'd left Sweetwater Creek. "Gaines won't just let this go, and I caused you trouble by—" "They won't come here." The absolute certainty in Caleb's voice stopped her protest. "And if they do, they'll regret it. You're under my protection now, Miss Rayner. That means something." He left before she could respond, pulling the door closed behind him. Esther finished her meal in silence, thinking about those words. "You're under my protection now." In another context from another man, they might have sounded possessive, threatening, but from Caleb, they sounded like a promise. like a vow he'd made before and intended to keep this time, because no one helped her. Who was she? The sister he'd mentioned, and what had happened to make Caleb Holt into the kind of man who would face down 3 armed thugs for a stranger? Esther suspected the answers to those questions would be as dark and complicated as the man himself. But for tonight, she was too tired and too sore to worry about mysteries. She finished her water, changed into the nightgown Caleb had left, and crawled back into bed. The sheets smelled of lavender and sunshine, and the pillow was soft beneath her aching head. Outside, she could hear the evening sounds of the ranch horses nickering in the corral, cattle lowing in the distance, the rustle of wind through the cottonwoods. Safe sounds. Normal sounds. For the first time and longer than she could remember, Esther Rayner felt safe. And as she drifted into sleep, she thought about gray eyes and gentle hands and a quiet voice promising that she would stand with him. Whatever tomorrow brought, she would face it. But tonight she would rest. Morning came too early, announced by roosters and the distant lowing of cattle. Esther woke to pain, a dull, persistent ache that radiated from her ribs and settled deep in her bones. But it was manageable pain, the kind that told her body was healing rather than breaking down. She lay still for a moment, watching dust motes dance in the shaft of sunlight that cut through the window, and tried to remember the last time she'd woken somewhere that felt safe. She couldn't. The smell of coffee and frying bacon drifted under the door, making her stomach growl despite the meal she'd eaten last night. Esther pushed herself upright, carefully testing each movement, and found that while everything hurt, nothing was unbearable. Her wrists were still wrapped in Caleb's careful bandages, and when she touched her face, the swelling had gone down slightly. She dressed slowly in her own clothes. The torn calico dress was ruined, but someone Caleb presumably had left a clean shirt and a pair of work pants folded on the chair. They were too large, clearly meant for a man, but they were clean and whole. Esther rolled up the sleeves and cuffs, cinched the pants with a length of rope she found in the washstand drawer, and made her way to the main room. Caleb stood at the stove, his back to her, working a cast-iron skillet with the ease of long practice. He'd changed into fresh clothes, a blue cotton shirt and dark pants, and his hair was still damp from washing. The morning light caught the strong lines of his profile as he turned the bacon, and Esther found herself studying him properly for the first time. He was younger than she'd initially thought, probably no more than 32 or 33, but he carried himself with the weariness of someone who'd lived twice that long. There were scars on his hands. She noticed white lines across his knuckles, a puckered mark on his left forearm that looked like a knife wound. A man who'd fought and survived. "Coffee's on the table," he said without turning around. "Cups are in the cupboard to your left." Esther found a tin cup and poured herself coffee from the battered pot. It was strong and black and perfect. She wrapped her hands around the warm metal and took a seat at the table, watching Caleb work. "How'd you sleep, Bust?" he asked, sliding bacon onto a plate. "Better than I have in months, Sassy," Esther admitted. "Thank you for all of this." "No need to thank me." He cracked eggs into the skillet, the sound sharp in the quiet kitchen. "How's the pain?" "Tolerable." He glanced at her over his shoulder, one eyebrow raised. "That means it hurts like hell, but you're too proud to say so." Despite everything, Esther felt a smile tug at her lips. "Maybe. There's willow bark tea if you need it. Won't take all the pain away, but it'll help." "I'll manage." Caleb shook his head but didn't argue. He finished cooking the eggs, divided everything onto 2 plates, and brought them to the table. The portions were generous: 3 eggs, 4 strips of bacon, and thick slices of bread toasted over the stove. Esther's stomach clenched with hunger at the sight. They ate in companionable silence for a few minutes. Esther tried not to wolf down the food, tried to maintain some semblance of dignity, but it had been so long since she'd had a proper breakfast that restraint was nearly impossible. "When you're ready," Caleb said, mopping up egg yolk with his bread. "I've got a proposition for you." Esther's hand froze halfway to her mouth. Every survival instinct she'd honed over years of hard living suddenly screamed a warning. Men always had propositions. Men always wanted something. She set down her fork carefully, her expression going carefully neutral. What kind of proposition? Caleb must have heard the change in her tone, the sudden wariness, because he looked up sharply. Understanding flickered across his face, followed by something that might have been anger, not at her, but at every man who'd made her afraid of simple words. Not that kind, he said firmly. Jesus, Esther. I mean, work. Honest work if you want it. The tension in her shoulders eased slightly. I'm listening. He pushed his empty plate aside and leaned back in his chair. I run this ranch alone most of the time. Got a hand who comes in twice a week to help with the heavy labor name's Tobias Goodman. You'll like him, but the day-to-day work is all me. Cooking, cleaning, mending, tending the garden, preserving food for winter. It's more than one person can manage and still keep up with the livestock and land. You want a housekeeper, Esther said. I want help. Someone I can trust. Someone who will earn fair wages for fair work and build themselves a stake while they figure out what comes next. He met her eyes steadily. Room and board plus $20 a month. That's more than you'd make in town, and you won't have to deal with men like Luther Gaines. $20 a month. Esther's breath caught. That was more money than she'd ever made in her life, more than she'd dreamed of making. With wages like that, she could save up. Maybe buy a train ticket to California. Start fresh somewhere far from Texas, and men who thought they owned women's choices. Why? She asked. You could hire anyone. Someone from Bridgeport, someone with references and experience. Why me? Caleb was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was soft, almost distant. My sister's name was Sarah. She was 16 when she died. Sweetest girl you ever met, always laughing, always seeing the good in people, even when they didn't deserve it. Esther's chest tightened. She knew somehow that what came next would be terrible. She worked in a hotel in Abilene, Caleb continued, his eyes fixed on something far beyond the walls of the kitchen. Cleaning rooms, same as you did in Sweetwater Creek. One night, 3 men came in drunk. Sons of a wealthy rancher used to getting what they wanted. They cornered her in one of the rooms. Caleb, Esther started, but he kept talking, the words coming faster now, like poison he needed to purge. They raped her, beat her, left her for dead in that room. His hands clenched into fists on the table. The hotel owner found her the next morning. By the time I got there, I was working as a scout. 3 days right away, she'd been buried 2 weeks. The men who did it, their father paid off the law. No charges filed, no justice served. My God, Esther whispered. I spent 3 years hunting them down, Caleb said flatly. Found 2 of them. Made sure they'd never hurt another woman. The third one? His jaw tightened. The third one got away. Went west with an outlaw gang. Last I heard, he was riding with a man named Calvin Blackwell. The name meant nothing to Esther, but the way Caleb said it with barely controlled rage, simmering beneath each syllable, told her everything she needed to know. I'm sorry, she said inadequately. I'm so sorry that happened to your sister. So am I. Caleb's gray eyes refocused on her. But that's why I helped you yesterday, because I couldn't help Sarah. Because I saw those men beating you in the street, and I saw her alone in that hotel room with no one coming to save her. And I thought not again. Not if I can stop it. Esther felt tears prick her eyes. She blinked them back furiously. You're a good man, Caleb Holt. No, he said. I'm not. Good men don't track people across 3 states and kill them in cold blood. Good men don't spend years consumed by vengeance. I'm just a man trying to do better. Trying to be what Sarah deserved and didn't get. He stood abruptly carrying his plate to the wash basin. The job offer stands. Think about it. If you want to move on, I'll give you money for the stage and send you on your way with my blessing. But if you want to stay, you're welcome here as long as you need. Esther didn't need to think about it. She'd known her answer the moment he'd explained the terms. I'll stay, she said, and I'll earn every penny you pay me. Caleb turned, and for the first time since she'd met him, she saw something that might have been relief cross his features. All right then. Soon as you're healed up enough to work, we'll get started. Until then, you rest and recover. No arguments. One condition, Esther said. His eyebrows rose. What's that? You teach me to shoot. Caleb studied her for a long moment. Then he nodded slowly. Yeah, I can do that. The days that followed settled into a rhythm that felt almost normal. Esther spent the first 3 days mostly resting, letting her body heal while she watched Caleb work the ranch. He rose before dawn and didn't stop until after dark, feeding horses, mending fences, checking on cattle, a dozen tasks that required constant attention. She noticed he never went into Sarah's room, never even glanced at the closed door when he passed it in the hallway. Some griefs she understood were too deep to revisit. On the fourth day, Esther insisted on helping with the cooking. Caleb protested, but she overruled him, pointing out that standing at a stove was hardly strenuous labor. They worked side by side in the kitchen, and Esther discovered that Caleb was a surprisingly competent cook. His meals were simple but well seasoned, and he knew his way around preserving and canning. "Sarah taught me," he said when Esther complimented a particularly good pot roast. "After our parents died, it was just the two of us. She insisted I learn to fend for myself. Said she wouldn't always be around to take care of me." The irony of those words hung heavy in the air. On the fifth day, Tobias arrived, a weathered black man in his 50s with kind eyes and hands scarred from decades of hard work. He took Esther's presence in stride, simply tipping his hat and saying, "Ma'am," before getting to work alongside Caleb. Esther watched them repair a section of the corral fence, their movements coordinated through long practice, and felt a pang of something she couldn't quite name. Envy, maybe. For the easy camaraderie between them, for the sense of belonging that came from shared purpose. That evening, after Tobias had ridden back to his own small homestead 5 miles south, Caleb kept his promise about shooting lessons. He set up a row of tin cans on a fence post 50 feet from the house, then returned with 2 guns, his own Colt, and a smaller revolver that fit more easily in Esther's hand. "This was Sarah's," he said, handing it to her. "It's a .32 caliber, not as much stopping power as mine, but easier to handle and plenty effective at close range." Esther took the gun carefully, feeling the weight of it, the cool metal against her palm. "Will you tell me how to use it?" For the next hour, as the sun sank toward the horizon, Caleb taught her the fundamentals. How to load and unload safely. How to stand, how to aim, how to squeeze the trigger rather than jerking it. He stood behind her, his hands guiding hers, his voice calm and patient as he corrected her form. "Don't fight the recoil," he said. "Expect it, move with it. The gun's going to kick, that's physics. Your job is to control it, not eliminate it." Esther fired her first shot. The can didn't move, but a puff of dust kicked up 3 feet to the left. "Again?" Caleb said. She fired again. Closer this time, but still a miss. "You're anticipating the recoil, flinching before you pull the trigger." He adjusted her grip slightly. "Trust yourself. Smooth, steady pressure." The third shot clipped the edge of a can, sending it spinning. "There," Caleb said, and she could hear the approval in his voice. "Do that 5 more times, and you'll have the basics." By the time darkness forced them to stop, Esther had knocked down 3 cans and come close to hitting 2 others. Her hands ached from the unfamiliar grip, and her ears rang despite Caleb's warnings to expect the noise, but she felt something she hadn't felt in years. She felt powerful. "You're a natural," Caleb said, collecting the scattered cans. "Another few weeks of practice, and you'll be dangerous." "Good," Esther said. "I want to be dangerous." He looked at her, then really looked at her, and something in his expression shifted. "You already are," he said quietly. "You just didn't know it yet." By the end of the first week, Esther had recovered enough to take on more substantial work. She threw herself into it with determined energy, cooking meals, cleaning the house, mending Caleb's worn clothes, tending the vegetable garden that had been neglected during Sarah's absence. The work was hard but satisfying, and every night she fell into bed exhausted and content. Slowly, carefully, they began to talk. Not about heavy things at first, just small exchanges during meals or while working side by side. Caleb told her about buying the ranch 5 years ago with money saved from his army pay. About the challenges of ranching in Texas, where droughts could ruin you and cattle thieves were always a threat. About his plans to expand the herd next spring if the winter wasn't too harsh. Esther told him about her childhood in St. Louis, about the good years before her mother died, when there'd been enough food and her father had still smiled occasionally. About her love of reading, cultivated in stolen moments with borrowed books. About the dream she'd once had of opening her own dress shop, designing clothes for women who wanted beauty as well as practicality. "Why didn't you?" Caleb asked one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sunset. "Dreams require money," Esther said simply, "and I've spent my life just trying to survive." "Surviving's important," Caleb acknowledged, "but it's not the same as living." She glanced at him. Is that what you're doing here, living?" He was quiet for a long moment. "Trying to," he said finally. "Some days are better than others." The second week brought challenges. Word had spread somehow, perhaps through Tobias, perhaps through ranch hands gossiping in Bridgeport, that Caleb Holt had taken in a woman from Sweetwater Creek, a woman accused of theft. The first indication came when they rode to Bridgeport for supplies. The town was larger than Sweetwater Creek, more civilized, with actual law enforcement that wasn't in anyone's pocket. But civilization didn't mean acceptance. Esther noticed the stares immediately, women whispering behind their hands, men looking her up and down with expressions ranging from curiosity to contempt. When she and Caleb entered the general store, the owner's wife actually crossed to the other side of the shop, as though Esther's mere presence might contaminate the merchandise. "Don't pay them any mind," Caleb murmured, loading supplies into a crate. "Small towns thrive on gossip. Give them a week and they'll find someone else to talk about." But the whispers followed them through the store into the street, all the way to where they'd tied Caleb's horse and the wagon. Esther kept her head high, refusing to show how the judgment stung, but inside she felt the familiar shame creeping back. They were loading the last of the supplies when a voice called out, "Caleb Holt!" They turned to find a man approaching, tall and rangy, maybe 40 years old, with a marshal's star pinned to his vest and a careful, assessing look in his eyes. He stopped a respectful distance away, his hand resting casually near his gun belt. "Marshal Garrett," Caleb said evenly. "What can I do for you? Heard you had some trouble down in Sweetwater Creek last week." Marshal Garrett's gaze flicked to Esther, then back to Caleb. "Heard you pulled a gun on some men working for Luther Gaines." "I stopped 3 men from beating a woman to death in the street," Caleb corrected. "If Gaines has a problem with that, he's welcome to file a complaint." "He did. Says this woman stole valuable property from him. Says you interfered with the law's business." "Marcus Finch isn't law," Caleb said flatly. "He's a thug with a badge that Gaines bought for him." Marshal Garrett sighed. "I don't disagree with you, but officially I need to ask, Miss, did you take a silver brooch from Luther Gaines or his establishment?" Esther met the marshal's eyes steadily. "No, sir, I did not. I've never stolen anything in my life. That brooch was planted in my bag because I refused Mr. Gaines's advances." "Do you have any proof of that?" the marshal asked Caleb. "Do Gaines and his men have proof she stole it?" Caleb countered. "Or just their word against hers?" "That's how these things usually work," Marshal Garrett admitted. He studied Esther for a moment longer, then seemed to come to a decision. "Look, between you and me, I know Gaines's reputation, and I know Finch. If Miss Rayner says she didn't steal, I'm inclined to believe her. But my jurisdiction ends at the Bridgeport town line. What happens in Sweetwater Creek is their business, not mine." "Then we won't be going back to Sweetwater Creek," Caleb said. "Probably wise." The marshal tipped his hat to Esther. "Ma'am, you take care. And Caleb, watch yourself. Gaines doesn't like being embarrassed. He's the type to hold a grudge." They watched the marshal walk away, disappearing into the afternoon crowd on the main street. "He seemed decent," Esther said quietly. "He is. One of the few honest lawmen left in this territory." Caleb finished securing the supplies and helped Esther up onto the wagon seat. "But he's right about Gaines. Man like that won't let this go." "I'm sorry," Esther said as Caleb climbed up beside her and took the reins. "I've brought trouble to your door." "You didn't bring anything. Gaines brought it." He urged the horses forward, guiding them out of town. "And I meant what I said. You're under my protection. That's not changing." They rode in silence for a while, the wagon rattling over the rutted road until the buildings of Bridgeport had faded behind them and they were surrounded by open country again. The sky was enormous, overhead blue and cloudless, and the wind carried the scent of sage and dust. "Can I ask you something?" Esther said. "Go ahead." "Do you ever think about settling down, getting married, having a family?" Caleb's hands tightened on the reins. "Used to. Before Sarah died, I thought about it all the time. Figured I'd meet some nice girl, build her a good home, raise children who'd work this land after I was gone. And now I don't know if I have the right." He stared straight ahead, his profile hard. "I've done things, Esther, bad things. Killed men in ways that weren't clean or honorable. Felt satisfaction watching them suffer. What kind of husband would that make me? What kind of father? The kind who learned from his mistakes, Esther said softly. The kind who's trying to do better. Maybe. He didn't sound convinced. Esther let the subject drop, but she filed the conversation away, turning it over in her mind during the long ride home. Caleb Holt was a man at war with himself, torn between the vengeance that had driven him for years and the desire for something better, something peaceful. She understood that war intimately. She'd fought it herself every time she'd been knocked down and had to choose whether to stay down or get back up. The difference was, she'd never had anyone to help her fight it. Maybe Caleb needed the same thing she did. Not saving exactly, they were both too broken for that. But companionship. Understanding. Someone who looked at their scars and didn't flinch away. That night after dinner was finished and the dishes washed, Esther found Caleb on the porch. He sat on the top step, a bottle of whiskey beside him, staring out at the darkening landscape. "May I join you?" she asked. He glanced up, surprised, then nodded and shifted over to make room. Esther sat down beside him, close enough that their shoulders almost touched. For a long time they didn't speak, just sat in the comfortable silence of two people who'd begun to understand each other without needing words. Finally, Caleb said, "You asked me earlier about settling down. Can I ask you the same thing?" "I used to dream about it," Esther admitted. "When I was younger and still believed in fairy tales. Thought some good man would come along and see past the poverty and the hard living. But that's not how the world works. Men don't marry women like me. They use us until we're worn out, then move on to the next one." "Some men," Caleb said. "Not all men." "Enough that it doesn't matter." He turned to look at her, then his gray eyes serious in the twilight. "For what it's worth, I think any man would be lucky to have you. You're strong, capable, smart as hell, and you don't back down from a fight. That counts for a lot more than pedigree or money." Esther felt heat rise in her cheeks. "You hardly know me." "I know enough." He held her gaze. "I know you took a beating that would have broken most people, and you're already back on your feet. I know you work harder than anyone I've met. I know you shoot straight and don't make excuses. That tells me everything I need to know." Something flickered between them, a spark of recognition of possibility. Esther felt her breath catch. She was suddenly intensely aware of how close they were sitting, of the warmth radiating from Caleb's body, of the way the fading light cast shadows across his strong features. Then Caleb looked away, breaking the moment. "I should check on the horses," he said, standing abruptly. "Early day tomorrow." Esther watched him walk toward the barn, confused and oddly disappointed. Whatever had been building between them, Caleb had deliberately stepped back from it. She didn't know whether to be grateful or frustrated. The third week brought Tobias back, and with him troubling news. He'd been in Bridgeport the day before, and heard talk in the saloon Luther Gaines had put out word that he was looking for Esther Rayner, offering money for information about where she'd gone. "How much money?" Caleb asked, his voice dangerously quiet. $50, Tobias said. "That's a lot of money for these parts. A lot of folks might be tempted." Caleb's jaw tightened. Let them try. But Esther could see the worry in his eyes. $50 was enough to make desperate men do foolish things. And there were always desperate men. "Maybe I should leave," she said that evening. "Head to California or somewhere Gaines can't reach me." "No." Caleb's response was immediate and absolute. "Running won't solve this. Gaines isn't going to stop just because you leave Texas. Men like him, they need to win. It's about control, not the money or even the principle. He wants you broken and punished for defying him." "Then what do? We stay alert. We prepare. And if he comes..." Caleb's hand moved to his gun. "We make sure he regrets it." The words should have frightened her. Instead, Esther felt oddly comforted. After years of facing threats alone, of having no one to stand beside her when trouble came, there was something profoundly reassuring about having someone say "we." As if reading her thoughts, Caleb added quietly, "You're not alone in this anymore, Esther. Whatever comes, we face it together." "Together," she repeated, and for the first time in her life, the word felt real. The threat arrived on a Tuesday morning, 3 weeks to the day after Caleb had carried Esther away from Sweetwater Creek. Tobias found it nailed to the fence post at the edge of the property, a crude piece of paper with words scrawled in an unsteady hand. He brought it to the house without reading it, his weathered face grim with concern. Caleb took the paper, his expression darkening as he read. When he finished, he crumpled it in his fist. "What does it say?" Esther asked, though part of her didn't want to know. "It says Luther Gaines knows where you are. It says he's coming to collect what's his." Caleb's voice was flat, emotionless, the tone of a man preparing for violence. "It says if I'm smart, I'll hand you over and save myself the trouble." Esther felt ice slide down her spine. "When?" "Doesn't say. Could be tomorrow. Could be next week." He tossed the crumpled paper into the fireplace. "Doesn't matter. We'll be ready either way." Tobias cleared his throat. "Want me to ride to Bridgeport, get the marshal?" By the time Garrett could get here, it'd be over one way or another. Caleb moved to the gun cabinet, a heavy wooden piece in the corner of the main room, and unlocked it with a key he wore on a chain around his neck. "No, we handle this ourselves." Inside the cabinet were weapons Esther hadn't seen before. 2 rifles, a shotgun, boxes of ammunition, and what looked like dynamite wrapped in oilcloth. Caleb began checking each weapon, methodically loading them, setting them in strategic positions around the house. "You know how to use a rifle?" he asked Tobias. "Well enough." "Good. I want you to take one and position yourself in the barn loft. You'll have a clear view of the approach from there. Anyone comes riding in looking hostile, you fire a warning shot. They don't turn around. You aim for the horses." Tobias nodded, taking the Winchester Caleb handed him. "Esther." Caleb turned to her. "You remember what I taught you about the revolver?" "Yes." "You're going to stay in the house. If shooting starts, you get to the back bedroom and stay low. There's a root cellar entrance under the bed. If things go bad, you use it. Head east through the gully, follow it 5 miles, you'll hit the McAllister Ranch. They're good people. They'll help you." "I'm not running," Esther said. "It's not running, it's surviving." Caleb's gray eyes locked on hers. "If Gaines brings enough men, Tobias and I might not be able to stop them all. I need to know you'll get out if that happens. And what about you?" "I'll do what I have to do." He pressed Sarah's revolver into her hands. "Promise me, Esther. Promise me you'll run if I tell you to." She wanted to argue, wanted to insist she'd stand and fight beside him, but the desperate intensity in his eyes stopped her. This wasn't about her courage or her stubbornness. It was about giving Caleb one less thing to worry about when violence came calling. "I promise," she said quietly. The relief that crossed his face was subtle but real. "Good. Now help me board up the windows." They spent the rest of the day preparing for siege. Caleb and Tobias reinforced the doors with heavy timber-covered windows with shutters that could be barred from inside, moved water barrels into the house, laid out ammunition where it could be reached quickly. Esther cooked enough food to last 3 days and filled every container she could find with water from the well. By sunset, the ranch had transformed from a peaceful homestead into a fortress. "Might be nothing," Tobias said as he prepared to take first watch in the barn. "Could be Gaines is just trying to scare you, make you sweat." "Maybe," Caleb agreed, but his hand never strayed far from his gun. That night, Esther lay in Sarah's bed fully clothed, the revolver on the nightstand beside her, and listened to the sounds of the ranch. Every creak of wood, every distant animal noise made her heart race. She dozed fitfully, never quite falling into deep sleep, always aware of Caleb moving through the house on his own patrol. Around 3 in the morning, she gave up on sleep entirely and padded out to the main room. Caleb sat at the table cleaning his Colt by lamplight, a cup of cold coffee at his elbow. "Can't sleep either?" he asked without looking up. "Too quiet," Esther said, taking the seat across from him. "It's the waiting that's hardest." "Always is." He reassembled the gun with practiced efficiency, each piece clicking into place with mechanical precision. During the war, before battles, men would get so worked up waiting that by the time fighting actually started, it was almost a relief. "Were you in the war?" "Tail end of it. I was just 16 when Lee surrendered, too young to have seen much action. But I saw enough." He holstered the Colt and met her eyes. "You scared." "Terrified," Esther admitted. "But I'm tired of running. Tired of letting men like Gaines dictate my life." "That's not cowardice talking that sense. There's no shame in wanting to live." "Is that what you want to live?" The question came out more pointed than she'd intended. Or are you just looking for a fight that'll finally finish what Sarah's death started? Caleb's expression went carefully blank. What's that supposed to mean? It means I've watched you these past 3 weeks. You're a good man, Caleb, but you're still hunting, still looking for ways to punish yourself for not saving her. And I wonder if part of you hopes Gaines comes with enough men that you don't have to keep living with the guilt. The silence that followed was brittle and dangerous. Caleb's jaw tightened, and for a moment Esther thought she'd pushed too far, broken through to something he wasn't ready to face. Then his shoulders sagged, and he looked away. Maybe you're right, he said quietly. Maybe I have been looking for an ending. But then you showed up, and suddenly I had something worth protecting again, something beyond revenge and guilt. He looked back at her, and the raw honesty in his eyes made her breath catch. You make me want to live, Esther. Really live, not just survive. And that scares me more than any gunfight. Esther reached across the table, covering his scarred hand with hers. Then we both fight. We both survive. And we figure out what living looks like on the other side. His fingers curled around hers, warm and strong. Deal. They sat like that until dawn, hands clasped, finding comfort in shared silence and the simple fact of not being alone. 2 days passed with no sign of trouble. Then 3. Caleb began to wonder if Tobias had been right, if the note was just intimidation, an attempt to make them paranoid and jumpy. On the 4th day, riders appeared on the horizon. Tobias saw them first from his position in the barn loft. His warning shot cracked across the morning air, sharp and unmistakable. Caleb grabbed his rifle and moved to the front window while Esther took position at the side window as they'd planned. Through the gap in the shutters, she counted 5 riders approaching at an easy pace. They weren't trying to hide or rush. They rode openly, confidently, like men who believed they held all the cards. Luther Gaines led them. Esther recognized him even at a distance, the expensive clothes, the way he sat his horse, like he owned the world beneath its hooves. The 4 men with him were hired guns, the kind of hard-eyed killers who could be found in any frontier town if you had the money to pay them. They stopped 50 yards from the house, just out of easy rifle range. "Caleb Holt!" Gaines called out, his voice carrying clearly in the still air. "I believe you have something that belongs to me." Caleb opened the front door just wide enough to be seen, his rifle cradled in his arms. "The only thing here that belongs to anyone is this land, and it's mine. Turn around and ride back to Sweetwater Creek while you still can." Gaines laughed, a cold sound without humor. "Now that's not very neighborly. I've come all this way to collect a thief and restore justice. Surely you can't object to that." "The only thief I see is you, Gaines, stealing a woman's reputation because she wouldn't warm your bed." The smile disappeared from Gaines's face. "Mind your tongue, Holt. I'm offering you a chance to walk away from this. Hand over the girl and my quarrel's not with you. And if I don't, then I'll burn this ranch to the ground and take her anyway." Gaines gestured to his men. "I've got 4 armed professionals here. You've got what yourself and an old ranch hand. Those odds don't favor you." From the barn loft, Tobias's voice rang out. "This old ranch hand was shooting Indians before you were born. Gaines, I can put a bullet through your eye from here." One of the hired guns shifted nervously in his saddle hand, moving toward his weapon. Caleb's rifle came up in response, smooth and fast. "First man who draws dies," Caleb said, his voice carrying absolute certainty. "Maybe your boys get me after maybe they don't. But you'll be dead either way, Gaines. Ask yourself if Esther Raynor's worth dying for." For a long, tense moment, nobody moved. The standoff hung suspended like a held breath, waiting for someone to make the choice that would turn words into bullets. Then Gaines smiled again, but it was strained this time, showing teeth. "You're a dead man, Holt. Maybe not today, but soon. I'll see you buried before this is finished." He wheeled his horse around, and after a moment's hesitation, his hired guns followed. They rode back the way they'd come, taking their time, refusing to show anything that might look like retreat. Caleb kept his rifle trained on them until they disappeared over the ridge. Only then did he lower the weapon, his hands shaking slightly with the aftermath of adrenaline. Esther emerged from her position at the window. "He's not giving up." "No," Caleb agreed. "He's just going to try a different approach." "How can you be sure?" "Because men like Gaines don't back down. They just get smarter about their attacks." He moved to secure the door again, his movements sharp with controlled tension. He'll wait until we let our guard down. Come at night, maybe, or hire more men, or... He trailed off, but Esther could fill in the rest. There were 1,000 ways for a wealthy man with no conscience to hurt people who'd defied him. Tobias came down from the loft, his rifle still in hand. We got lucky today. Next time, we might not. Then we don't give him a next time, Caleb said. We take the fight to him. Both Tobias and Esther stared at him. You can't be serious, Esther said. Ride into Sweetwater Creek, that's suicide. Not Sweetwater Creek, Bridgeport. Caleb set his rifle aside and moved to the table, his mind already working through the problem. Gaines has to come through Bridgeport to get to us. So we go to Bridgeport, make sure the whole town knows what he's doing, get witnesses, maybe even get Marshal Garrett involved officially. Garrett said his jurisdiction doesn't cover Sweetwater Creek, Tobias pointed out. But it covers Bridgeport, and if Gaines threatens us on Bridgeport soil, that's Garrett's business. Caleb looked at Esther. We make this public. We take away Gaines's ability to operate in shadow. It's risky, but it's better than sitting here waiting for him to burn us out. Esther thought about it, turning the plan over in her mind. It was bold, possibly reckless, but Caleb was right about one thing. They couldn't just hide and hope Gaines lost interest. Men like him never did. When she asked, tomorrow. We ride in together, all three of us. We talk to Garrett. We talk to anyone who'll listen. And we make sure everyone knows that if something happens to us, Gaines is responsible. And if Gaines is in Bridgeport when we get there, Tobias asked. Caleb's smile was cold and dangerous. Then we have that conversation face to face in front of witnesses, and we see if he's brave enough to start trouble with the law watching. The next morning dawned clear and bright, mocking the tension that thrummed through all of them. They rode to Bridgeport as a group, Caleb on his bay gelding, Esther on a gentle mare from his string, and Tobias on his own sturdy pinto. All three were armed, though they kept their weapons holstered and their manner as unthreatening as possible. They didn't want to start a fight, but they were prepared to finish one. Bridgeport was busier than Esther remembered from their supply run. The main street bustled with wagons and pedestrians, and the boardwalks were crowded with people going about their business. Several heads turned as they rode past recognition, flickering in curious eyes. Caleb led them directly to the marshal's office, a squat building near the center of town. They tied their horses and went inside, finding Marshal Garrett behind a battered desk covered in papers and wanted posters. He looked up as they entered, and something that might have been resignation crossed his weathered face. Caleb, he said, I had a feeling you'd be coming to see me. Then you know why we're here. Garrett stood, moving to close the office door behind them. Luther Gaines rode through here 3 days ago with 4 hired guns. Told anyone who'd listen that he was going to recover stolen property and that he hoped it wouldn't get ugly. That about sum it up. He threatened to burn my ranch and take Esther by force, Caleb said. I call that more than ugly. And he did this on your property in front of witnesses. Just me and Tobias. Garrett sighed. Then legally, it's your word against his, and Gaines will have 12 people swear he was in Sweetwater Creek the whole time if I try to bring charges. So there's nothing you can do? Esther asked, trying to keep the desperation from her voice. I didn't say that. The marshal pulled out a chair, gesturing for them to sit. Look, I know what Gaines is. Half the lawmen in Texas know. But he's careful, covers his tracks, pays the right people. If I'm going to move against him, I need evidence that'll stick. Something more than hearsay. What if he comes after us again? Caleb asked. Then you defend yourselves, and you make damn sure you've got witnesses when you do it. Garrett met Caleb's eyes steadily. I can't stop Gaines from being a bastard. But if he breaks the law in my town in front of people I can trust, I'll put him in chains myself. You have my word on that. It wasn't much, but it was something. More than they'd had before. They left the marshal's office and walked down the main street, making themselves visible, letting the town see that they weren't hiding. They stopped at the general store, bought supplies they didn't really need, and made conversation with the owner. They had lunch at the hotel restaurant, sitting by the window where anyone could see them. All the while, Esther felt eyes on them, some curious, some judgmental, some sympathetic. She kept her head high, refusing to show the fear that churned in her stomach. They were halfway through their meal when the door opened and Luther Gaines walked in. He wasn't alone. Two of his hired guns flanked him, hard-eyed men with weapons displayed prominently at their hips. Gaines himself looked every inch the respectable businessman in his tailored suit and polished boots, but there was something reptilian in his smile as his eyes found Esther. "Well," he said loudly enough for the entire restaurant to hear, "if it isn't the infamous Esther Rayner. I'd heard you were still lurking about." Caleb's hand dropped to his gun, but Esther touched his arm, stopping him. This was exactly what Gaines wanted, a public confrontation that he could twist to his advantage. "Mr. Gaines," she said coolly, "I'm surprised you'd show your face after making threats against innocent people." "Threats?" Gaines clutched his chest in mock offense. "I merely stated my intention to pursue justice for the theft of my property. Surely there's nothing threatening about that. Your property was never stolen, and you know it." "Do I?" He took a step closer, his hired guns moving with him. "Because I have 3 witnesses who saw that brooch in your bag. 3 upstanding citizens against the word of a drifter with no family and no prospects. Who do you think people will believe?" Around them, the restaurant had gone quiet. Every eye was on their exchange, watching, judging. Esther could feel the weight of their attention, could sense them weighing her worthiness against Gaines's respectability. "I think," Caleb said, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade, "that people will believe the man who has to hire guns to fight his battles is a coward hiding behind money and influence." Gaines's smile froze. "Careful, Holt. You're making accusations you can't prove." Everyone in this room saw you walk in here with armed thugs to intimidate a woman who's done nothing wrong. That tells me everything I need to know about your character." One of the hired guns stepped forward, hand moving toward his weapon. "You want to take that back." The room held its breath. In the corner, Tobias's hand had found his rifle. At the window table, Esther's fingers brushed the revolver hidden in her bag. One wrong move and the restaurant would become a slaughterhouse. Then a new voice cut through the tension. "That's enough!" Marshal Garrett stood in the doorway, his own hand on his gun. "Gaines, tell your boys to stand down before this gets out of hand." "Marshal," Gaines said smoothly, though his eyes remained locked on Caleb. "We were just having a conversation." "Looked more like a threat to me, and I don't allow that kind of behavior in my town." Garrett moved into the room, his presence commanding immediate respect. "Now you've got business in Bridgeport, conduct it peacefully. Otherwise, take yourself and your hired guns back to Sweetwater Creek, where you belong." For a moment, Gaines looked like he might argue. Then he seemed to recalculate, remembering that they had an audience, that anything he said or did here would be witnessed and remembered. "Of course, Marshal," he said with exaggerated courtesy. "I wouldn't dream of disturbing your town's peace." He looked at Esther one last time, and all pretense of civility dropped from his expression. "But justice will be served one way or another. Count on it." He turned and walked out, his hired guns following. The tension in the room eased slightly, though conversations remained hushed and wary. Garrett moved to their table. "You 3 all right?" "Fine," Caleb said. "Thanks for the intervention." "That's what I'm here for." The marshal pulled up a chair, sitting down uninvited. "But you need to understand something. I can keep the peace in town, but I can't protect you once you leave. Gaines knows that. He's just waiting for his opportunity." "We know," Esther said quietly. "Then what's your plan?" "You can't stay in Bridgeport forever, and you can't live under siege at the ranch." Caleb exchanged glances with Tobias, some silent communication passing between them. "We handle it ourselves when the time comes." "By handle it, you mean..." "I mean, we defend what's ours. No more, no less." Garrett studied them for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "All right. Just make sure when that time comes, you've got witnesses. And make sure you're on the right side of the law." After he left, they finished their meal in silence. The other diners gradually returned to their conversations, though Esther noticed people still glancing their way, still whispering behind their hands. "We should head back," Tobias said quietly, "before Gaines decides to follow us and finish this on the road." Caleb nodded, dropping coins on the table to cover their meal. They filed out of the restaurant and collected their horses, aware of eyes tracking their every movement. The ride back to the ranch felt longer than the ride in each mile, weighted with anticipation and dread. They watched the ridge lines for riders, studied every shadow that might conceal an ambush. but the trail remained clear, and they made it home without incident. That night, Caleb doubled the watch, and none of them slept soundly. 3 more days passed, then 4. The tension became a living thing, coiled tight, and all of them waiting to spring. Esther threw herself into work, trying to exhaust her body enough that her mind would quiet. Caleb patrolled constantly, rifle always in hand. Even Tobias, usually unflappable, jumped at unexpected sounds. On the 5th night, Esther woke to the smell of smoke. She bolted upright, heart hammering, already knowing what it meant. Through the window, she could see orange light flickering against the darkness fire, coming from the direction of the barn. She grabbed her revolver and ran for the main room, nearly colliding with Caleb in the hallway. He was already dressed, already armed, his face grim in the firelight filtering through the windows. "Barn's burning," he said tersely. "Tobias went to check on it. I heard gunshots. Oh, God." "Stay inside, bar the door behind me. If anyone but me or Tobias tries to come through, you shoot them." He was moving toward the door even as he spoke, but Esther caught his arm. "Don't go out there alone. It's what they want to separate us, pick us off one by one." Caleb hesitated, torn between protecting the ranch and protecting her. Before he could decide, more gunshots cracked through the night, rapid fire coming from multiple directions. The attack had begun. Caleb shoved Esther toward the back of the house, even as bullets punched through the wooden shutters, splinters, exploding inward like shrapnel. "Get down!" They hit the floor together, crawling toward cover as another volley tore through the windows. The sound was deafening, rifles, cracking glass, shattering wood, splintering under the relentless assault. Outside, the barn blazed like a funeral pyre, casting writhing shadows across the yard and turning night into a hellish approximation of day. "How many?" Esther gasped, pressing herself against the wall beneath the window. "At least 6, maybe more." Caleb belly crawled to the gun cabinet, yanking it open and tossing Esther a Winchester. "They've got us surrounded. Barn corral probably men at the back of the house, too." As if to confirm his words, shots rang out from behind the building, bullets thudding into the rear wall. They were boxed in, caught in a crossfire designed to pin them down and burn them out. "Tobias," Esther started, "is either dead or fighting." Caleb's voice was hard controlled, but she could hear the worry beneath it. "Right now, we focus on staying alive." He moved to the front window, rising just enough to see over the sill. Muzzle flashes lit the darkness beyond the burning barn. 4 men, maybe 5, using the corral fence and water trough for cover. One was reloading, exposed for just a moment. Caleb's rifle barked once. The man screamed and fell. "One down," he said grimly, dropping back behind cover as return fire shredded the window frame above his head. "Dozen more to go." Esther scrambled to the side window, the one that faced toward the smokehouse and the small cluster of outbuildings. She could see shapes moving in the firelight, men advancing under cover of darkness and confusion. Her hands shook as she brought the Winchester to her shoulder, but she forced herself to breathe to remember Caleb's lessons. Smooth, steady pressure. "Don't fight the recoil." She fired at a moving shadow. Missed. Worked the lever, chambering another round, fired again. This time, she heard a yelp of pain and the shadow fell back. "Good," Caleb called. "Keep them pinned. Don't let them reach the house." They fell into a desperate rhythm. Shoot, reload, move to a different position before return fire could find them. The house filled with smoke and the acrid smell of gunpowder. Esther's ears rang from the constant barrage. Her shoulder ached from the rifle's kick, but she kept firing, kept moving, driven by fear and fury and the determination not to let Luther Gaines win. From somewhere outside came a different sound, a shotgun's deeper boom, followed by screaming. Then Tobias's voice, hoarse but strong. "Caleb! Coming in from the west!" Hope surged through Esther's chest. Tobias was alive. "Cover him!" Caleb shouted. He moved to the west-facing window and opened up with the rifle laying down, suppressing fire. Esther did the same from her position, shooting at anything that moved in the firelight. The front door burst open, and Tobias stumbled through, blood streaming from a gash on his forehead. He slammed the door behind him and dropped the heavy bar across it, then collapsed against the wall, chest heaving. 8 men, he gasped. Counted 8, maybe 9. Gaines is with them, staying back by the tree line. Coward, won't get his own hands dirty. "You hit," Caleb asked, already moving to check the older man's wounds. Just a graze. Head wounds bleed like hell, but it ain't deep. Tobias accepted the cloth Esther pressed into his hands, holding it against his bleeding scalp. They torched the barn first, tried to flush us out. When I didn't come running, they started shooting. Killed 2 of them before they pinned me down behind the water trough. The horses? Esther asked, though she already knew the answer. The anguished screaming from the barn had told her everything. Tobias's expression was bleak. Didn't suffer long. Smoke got them before the fire did. 4 good horses dead because Luther Gaines couldn't accept defiance from a woman. The waste of it, the cruelty made something hot and furious ignite in Esther's chest. We need to end this, she said. We can't just defend. They'll burn us out or wait until we run out of ammunition. She's right, Tobias said. They're patient. They'll keep us pinned until dawn, then rush us when we're exhausted. Caleb reloaded his rifle, his face a mask of concentration. There's another option. The dynamite in the cabinet, we could blow the smokehouse. It's close enough to their positions that the blast might scatter them, give us a chance to break the siege. And if it doesn't work? Esther asked. Then we die fighting instead of cowering. He met her eyes, and in them she saw the same cold determination that had driven him to hunt his sister's killers. But I'd rather go down swinging than let Gaines have the satisfaction of seeing us beg. Esther thought about the terrified woman she'd been 3 weeks ago, beaten in the dust, broken and helpless. She thought about the promise Caleb had made that she would stand with him, and she thought about the life they could have if they survived this night, the future that waited on the other side of violence. Do it, she said. Caleb nodded once, sharp and decisive. He moved to the cabinet and pulled out the dynamite, checking the fuses with experienced hands. I need to get close enough to the smokehouse to place the charges and light them. That means going outside. That's suicide, Tobias protested. Not if you two keep them busy. Caleb handed Tobias the Winchester and gave Esther extra ammunition for the revolver. I'll go out the back window. Soon as I'm clear, you open up from every window in the house. Make them think we're launching a full assault. They'll focus on you, won't notice one man moving in the shadows. And if they do notice, Esther's voice was steadier than she felt. Then you make sure Gaines doesn't leave this ranch alive. Caleb touched her cheek, his fingers gentle despite the calluses and gun oil. Whatever happens, Esther, you fight like hell. You hear me? You fight, and you survive, and you live the life you deserve. She caught his hand, pressing it against her face. Come back to me. Count on it. He kissed her, then hard and quick, a promise sealed with lips and breath and desperation. Then he was moving toward the back of the house, toward the window they'd left unbarred for exactly this kind of desperate gambit. Esther watched him go, memorizing the line of his shoulders, the determined set of his jaw. If this was the last time she saw him alive, she wanted to remember everything. Then she turned to Tobias. Ready. The old ranch hand checked his rifle, his weathered face set in grim lines. Been ready since them sons of bitches lit my barn on fire. They took positions at opposite windows. Esther counted to 10, giving Caleb time to slip outside. Then she and Tobias opened fire, simultaneously shooting at every muzzle flash, every shadow, every hint of movement in the compound. The attackers responded with overwhelming force, bullets hammering the house from 3 sides. Wood splintered, glass shattered. One round passed so close to Esther's head that she felt the heat of its passage. But she kept firing, kept moving, forcing the gunmen to keep their heads down and their attention on the house. Through the chaos, she caught a glimpse of Caleb, a dark shape moving low and fast toward the smokehouse, invisible against the deeper shadows cast by the burning barn. He reached the building and pressed himself against its wall, working quickly to place the dynamite charges. One of Gaines's men spotted him. The gunman rose from behind the corral fence rifle, coming up, drawing a bead on Caleb's exposed position. Esther didn't think. She turned and fired in one smooth motion, the revolver bucking in her hand. The gunman jerked backward, his shot going wild, and collapsed. Caleb glanced back, saw what she'd done, and nodded once in acknowledgement. Then he struck a match, lit the fuses, and ran. "Get down!" Esther screamed. She threw herself behind the heavy wooden table, pulling Tobias down with her. The explosion was enormous, a wall of sound and pressure that shook the house to its foundations. The windows that had survived the gunfight blew inward, showering them with glass. Esther felt the table lift slightly off the floor, then slam back down. Her ears went deaf, replaced by a high-pitched ringing that drowned out everything else. For a long moment there was only silence and smoke and the awful realization that she didn't know if Caleb had gotten clear. Then she heard screaming. Esther forced herself to her feet, staggering to the window. The smokehouse was gone, replaced by a crater and scattered debris. The blast had caught 3 of Gaines's men directly. They lay motionless in the yard, broken and still. 2 more were wounded, crawling away from the destruction, their weapons forgotten. And there, limping toward the house but alive, was Caleb. Relief hit Esther so hard she nearly collapsed. She ran to the door, throwing off the bar, yanking it open. Caleb stumbled through and she caught him, half supporting his weight, as Tobias slammed the door shut and barred it again. "I'm all right," Caleb gasped, though blood streamed from a cut above his eye and he favored his left leg. "Just got clipped by debris, nothing broken." "You beautiful, crazy bastard," Tobias said, and there was equal parts admiration and disbelief in his voice. It worked. But their celebration was short-lived. From the darkness beyond the burning barn came a voice loud and furious. "Halt! You killed my men. You're done, you hear me? Finished." Luther Gaines finally showing himself, his expensive suit ruined by soot and dirt. He stood at the edge of the firelight, a rifle in his hands, his face contorted with rage and humiliation. Caleb moved to the broken window, his own rifle coming up. "You started this, Gaines. You came to my land, burned my property, tried to kill me and mine. Everything that's happened is on you. I wanted the girl, that's all, just the girl she stole from me. She stole nothing, and you know it." Caleb's voice carried across the compound, loud enough that any surviving gunman could hear, loud enough to be testimony if any of them lived to tell the tale. "You planted that brooch because she refused to be your whore. You came here with hired killers because your ego couldn't stand being told no. Every death tonight is your fault, Gaines, yours." For a moment, Gaines seemed to deflate, realizing perhaps that he'd gone too far, that there was no walking back from this night's work. Then his face hardened with the desperate fury of a man who'd lost everything and had nothing left to lose. "If I'm damned," he snarled, raising his rifle, "then I'm taking you with me." 3 things happened simultaneously. Gaines fired. His bullet struck the window frame, missing Caleb by inches. Caleb fired back. His bullet caught Gaines in the shoulder, spinning him around. And from the tree line where Gaines had been hiding came more shots, not at the house this time, but at Gaines himself. The saloon owner went down, hard blood blooming across his chest, his rifle falling from nerveless fingers. Riders emerged from the trees, and Esther's heart leaped as she recognized the lead figure, Marshal Garrett, with 3 deputies fanned out beside him, all with weapons drawn. "Hold your fire," Garrett shouted. "This is the law. Everyone hold your damn fire." The remaining gunmen, only 2 still standing, plus the 2 wounded from the explosion, threw down their weapons and raised their hands. The fight went out of them in an instant now that their employer was down and the law had arrived. Garrett dismounted and moved to where Gaines lay in the dirt. He knelt, checking for a pulse, then looked toward the house. "He's alive. Barely. Someone want to tell me what happened here?" Caleb lowered his rifle and stepped out onto the porch, Esther and Tobias flanking him. "Gaines attacked my ranch with hired guns, burned my barn, killed my horses, tried to kill us. We defended ourselves." "That true?" Garrett asked one of the surviving gunmen. The man, pale and shaking, nodded quickly. "Yes, sir. Mr. Gaines hired us to run them off. Said he'd pay double if we killed the girl. He was real specific about making her suffer." Garrett's expression darkened. He stood gesturing to his deputies. "Get Gaines loaded up. He's going to jail, assuming he survives long enough to hang." He turned to the other gunmen. "You boys too. I'll sort out charges later, but you're all under arrest for attempted murder and arson at minimum." As the deputies moved to secure the prisoners, Garrett walked toward the house. He stopped at the bottom of the porch steps, looking up at Caleb with something that might have been respect. "I was in town when word came that riders were headed this way with torches and guns," he said. "Took me near 2 hours to round up deputies and get here. I'm sorry it wasn't sooner." "You came," Caleb said simply. "That's what matters." Garrett's gaze shifted to Esther. "Miss Rayner, I owe you an apology. I should have acted sooner, should have pushed harder to investigate Gaines before it came to this. You're here now, Esther said, echoing Caleb's words, and Gaines will face justice. That's enough. The marshal nodded slowly. We'll need statements from all of you, but that can wait until morning. For now, you folks look like you could use some rest. Rest? The word seemed almost laughable. Esther looked around at the destruction. The burning barn now collapsed into glowing embers, the crater where the smokehouse had stood, the bodies scattered across the yard, the shattered windows of the house. This place that had been her sanctuary, her refuge, now looked like a battlefield. But they were alive. Against all odds, they had survived. After the deputies led the prisoners away and Garrett promised to return at first light, an eerie silence settled over the ranch. The fire had burned itself out, leaving only smoke and ash. Caleb, Esther, and Tobias stood in the yard surveying the damage by starlight. Could have been worse, Tobias said finally. Caleb barked a laugh, short and bitter. How do you figure we're still breathing? That's something. The older man clapped Caleb on the shoulder. I'm going to bed down in the bunkhouse, what's left of it. You two should get some rest too. Morning's going to come fast, and there's a world of work ahead. After Tobias limped away, Caleb and Esther stood alone in the ruins of the ranch. She took his hand, their fingers interlacing naturally, and felt him squeeze gently. You saved my life, he said quietly. That gunman who had me lined up, if you hadn't shot him, I'd be dead. You saved mine first, in Sweetwater Creek, and every day since. Esther turned to face him, studying his soot-stained face, the cuts and bruises that marked him. We saved each other. Yeah. He touched her face thumb, brushing along her cheekbone. We did. They stood like that for a long moment. Two people who'd been broken by life and violence and had somehow found wholeness in each other. Then Caleb pulled her close, wrapping his arms around her, and Esther let herself lean into his strength, let herself be held. It's over, she whispered against his chest. It's finally over. Not quite. Caleb's voice rumbled through his chest, vibrating against her ear. Gaines might survive. There'll be a trial testimony, all of that. And we have to rebuild the barn, the outbuildings, everything we lost tonight. But we're alive to do it. Esther pulled back just enough to look up at him. And we're together. That's what matters. Something shifted in Caleb's expression, some final wall coming down, some last barrier crumbling under the weight of everything they'd endured. When he spoke, his voice was raw with emotion. I love you, Esther Rayner. I think I've loved you since the moment I picked you up out of that dust in Sweetwater Creek. You're the strongest, bravest woman I've ever known, and I don't want to spend another day of my life without you in it. Esther's breath caught. She'd known somewhere deep in her heart that her feelings had grown beyond gratitude or friendship. But hearing Caleb say the words, seeing the vulnerability in his eyes, made it real in a way that shook her to her foundations. I love you too, she said, and felt tears track through the soot on her cheeks. God help me, I love you so much it terrifies me. He kissed her then properly this time, not the desperate press of lips from before the battle, but something slower, deeper, a promise that spoke of futures and forever. Esther kissed him back, pouring everything she felt into it, all the fear and relief and hope and love that had been building in her for weeks. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Caleb rested his forehead against hers. Marry me, he said. Not because you need protection or because I need someone to help run the ranch. Marry me because we're better together than we ever could be apart. Because I want to wake up next to you every morning and fall asleep holding you every night. Because I want to build a life with you, a real life full of all the things we've been denied. Esther laughed, the sound catching on a sob. That's the worst proposal I've ever heard. It's the only proposal you've ever heard, Caleb pointed out. True. She pulled back, holding his face between her hands, making sure he could see the absolute certainty in her eyes. Yes, I'll marry you, Caleb Holt, on one condition. Name it. We do this as equals, partners in everything, the ranch, our lives, our choices. I'm not looking to be saved or taken care of. I'm looking for someone to stand beside. That, Caleb said, smiling for the first time since the attack, is exactly what I'm offering. They sealed the agreement with another kiss there in the wreckage of the battle, surrounded by ash and smoke and the promise of dawn. And when they finally made their way back to the house supporting each other's weight, Esther felt something she'd never truly believed she'd experience. She felt like she was coming home. The next weeks passed in a blur of testimony and reconstruction. Luther Gaines survived his wounds long enough to stand trial in Bridgeport, where he faced charges of attempted murder, arson, conspiracy, and a dozen other crimes. The surviving gunmen turned state's evidence describing in detail how Gaines had hired them to terrorize Caleb's ranch and kill everyone there. The trial lasted 3 days. The jury deliberated for 20 minutes. Gaines was sentenced to hang. Esther attended the sentencing sitting beside Caleb in the crowded courtroom. When the judge read the verdict, she felt no satisfaction, no triumph, only a weary relief that it was finally truly over. Gaines would pay for his crimes, and she could move forward without looking over her shoulder. As they left the courthouse, Marcus Finch was waiting on the steps. The corrupt lawman from Sweetwater Creek had been stripped of his badge and charged as an accomplice to Gaines's crimes. He looked smaller now, diminished without authority to hide behind. "Miss Rayner," he said as she passed. I'm sorry for what I did to you in Sweetwater. I was following orders, but that ain't an excuse. You didn't deserve what we done." Esther stopped studying the broken man before her. She could hold on to anger, could nurse the grudge for the beating he'd given her, or she could let it go, could choose to move forward rather than remain anchored to the past. "I'm not going to say it's all right," she said quietly. "Because it wasn't. What you did was evil, and you'll have to live with that. But I forgive you, Mr. Finch, not for your sake, for mine. I'm done letting men like you and Gaines have power over my life." She walked away without looking back, and when Caleb took her hand, she squeezed tightly, drawing strength from his presence. At the ranch, rebuilding progressed faster than expected. Word of the attack had spread, and with it came an unexpected outpouring of support from the community. Ranchers and townspeople who'd heard about a woman standing up to Luther Gaines, about a man defending his home against corruption, arrived with tools and materials and willing hands. Within a month, a new barn stood where the old one had burned. The smokehouse was rebuilt stronger than before. Windows were replaced, walls patched the scars of battle, slowly disappearing under fresh paint and new wood. Tobias worked alongside them every day, his grizzled face creasing into smiles as the ranch came back to life. "Never seen folks rally like this," he said one evening as they surveyed the progress. "It's like you two gave them hope that decent people can still win." "Winning's easy," Caleb set his arm around Esther's waist. "It's what you do with the win that matters." They were married on a cool Saturday morning in early autumn in a simple ceremony at the Bridgeport church. Marshall Garrett stood as witness along with Tobias and a handful of townspeople who'd become genuine friends during the rebuilding. Esther wore a dress she'd made herself, simple but beautiful white cotton with blue flowers embroidered at the collar, and carried wildflowers picked from the meadow near the ranch. When Caleb lifted her veil and kissed her as his wife Esther felt tears stream down her face. But they were good tears, joyful tears, the kind that came from happiness, too large to be contained. The reception was held at the ranch with tables set up in the new barn and food enough to feed half the county. People danced to fiddle music and shared stories and toasted the newlyweds until the stars came out and the moon rose high. Late in the evening, Caleb pulled Esther away from the celebration, leading her to the porch, where they'd spent so many quiet hours together. The sounds of laughter and music drifted through the open windows, but here in their private space there was peace. "Happy?" he asked, pulling her close. "More than I ever thought possible," Esther admitted. She rested her head against his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. "Sometimes I still can't believe this is real, that I get to have this life with you." "Believe it," Caleb kissed the top of her head. "This is just the beginning, Esther. We've got years ahead of us, years to build this ranch into something remarkable, years to fill this house with love, and maybe children if we're blessed. Years to prove that people like us who've been knocked down and broken can still build something beautiful." Esther looked up at him, seeing not just the man who'd saved her from a beating, but the partner who'd stood beside her through everything that followed. The man who'd taught her to shoot and to trust again. The man who'd loved her enough to risk everything. "You know what I think," she said softly. "What's that?" "I think we already have." Winter came to the ranch like a benediction, soft and quiet, covering the land in a blanket of white that made everything look clean and new. Esther stood at the kitchen window on a gray December morning, watching snowflakes drift past the glass, and marveled at how different her life looked now compared to just 6 months ago. Behind her, Caleb moved around the kitchen, preparing breakfast, the domestic routine they'd fallen into as natural as breathing. She could hear him humming under his breath some old army song he'd probably learned during his scouting days, and the sound made her smile. "Coffee's ready," he said, coming up behind her and wrapping his arms around her waist. He rested his chin on her shoulder, looking out at the snow-covered pasture with her. "What are you thinking about?" "Everything," Esther said honestly. "How strange life is. How 6 months ago I was being beaten in the street, certain I was going to die. And now I'm here married to you, watching snow fall on our ranch, and I'm happy. Actually, genuinely happy." Caleb tightened his embrace. "You deserve to be happy." "So do you." She turned in his arms, cupping his face in her hands. "Have I told you today that I love you?" "Not yet. Day's still young, though." "Well, I do. More than I have words for." She kissed him softly, then pulled back with a smile. "Now feed me before I perish from hunger. Your child is demanding breakfast." The words hung in the air between them for a heartbeat. Then Caleb's eyes went wide, his hands moving to her still flat stomach. "You're... what?" Esther laughed at the expression on his face, shock and joy and terror all mingled together. "I'm pregnant, Caleb. About 2 months along, near as I can figure. I wanted to be sure before I told you." For a moment he just stared at her, speechless. Then he let out a whoop of joy that probably scared the horses, lifted her clear off her feet and spun her around the kitchen while she laughed and protested that he'd make her dizzy. "We're having a baby," he said, wonder in his voice as he set her carefully back down. "A real baby. Our baby." "That's generally how it works, yes." Caleb knelt suddenly, pressing his ear against her belly, even though there was nothing to hear yet, nothing to feel but the promise of life growing inside her. When he looked up, Esther saw tears in his eyes. "I swear to you," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "I will be the best father I know how to be. This child will grow up knowing they're loved, knowing they're safe, knowing they can be anything they want to be." "I know," Esther whispered, running her fingers through his hair. "I've never doubted that for a second." They spent the rest of the morning in a bubble of shared joy, making plans and dreaming aloud about the future. Caleb wanted to add another room to the house before the baby came, somewhere with good light and space for a cradle. Esther worried about whether she'd know how to be a mother, having lost her own so young, but Caleb reminded her that she'd figure it out the same way they'd figured out everything else together. Tobias arrived mid-morning to help with the winter chores, and the moment he saw their faces, he knew something had changed. "All right," he said, stomping snow off his boots. "You two look like cats that got into the cream. What's happened?" "We're going to have a baby," Caleb announced, unable to keep the pride from his voice. Tobias's weathered face split into a grin. "Well, I'll be damned. Congratulations to you both." He shook Caleb's hand, then surprised Esther by pulling her into a gentle hug. "That's fine news, real fine. This ranch could use the sound of children laughing again." The mention of children plural made Esther exchange a glance with Caleb. They'd talked about it in the abstract about filling the house with family, but hearing it stated so plainly made it feel more real. "One at a time," she said with a laugh. "Let's see how we manage the first one before we start planning a whole brood." But the image stayed with her throughout the day. Children running through the house, playing in the yard, learning to ride horses and tend cattle and build lives of their own. A legacy born not from violence and vengeance, but from love and hard work, and the choice to create something good. 2 days later, a letter arrived from Bridgeport. Caleb brought it in from the road, recognizing Marshall Garrett's careful handwriting on the envelope. They read it together at the kitchen table, Esther's hand finding Caleb's as the words sank in. Luther Gaines had been hanged at dawn the previous morning. He'd gone to the gallows, unrepentant, cursing Esther and Caleb to the last. But he'd gone nonetheless, justice served after years of corruption and cruelty. "It's over," Esther said quietly, staring at the letter. "It's really, truly over." Caleb folded the paper carefully and set it aside. "How do you feel?" I don't know. Esther searched for the right words. I thought I'd feel relieved, maybe even happy, but mostly I just feel empty. Like I've been carrying this weight for so long that now it's gone, I don't quite know what to do with the space it left behind. Fill it with other things, Caleb suggested. Better things. The baby, the ranch, building a life that has nothing to do with gains or what he tried to take from us. Is that what you did? After you found the men who killed Sarah. Caleb was quiet for a long moment, his gray eyes distant. I tried. Came out here, bought this land, told myself I'd start over. But the truth is, I was just running, trying to escape the guilt and the anger by putting distance between me and the memories. It wasn't until you showed up that I realized what I'd been missing. What's that purpose beyond revenge? Someone to build toward instead of something to run from. He squeezed her hand. You gave me a reason to live again, Esther. Not just survive, actually live. And now with the baby coming, it feels like everything that happened before, all the pain and loss, it was leading us to this moment, to this chance. Esther felt fresh tears prick her eyes. I love you so much. I love you too. He pulled her close, holding her against his chest. And I promise you our children will never know the kind of fear and pain we did. They'll grow up safe and loved and free. It was a promise he would spend the rest of his life keeping. Spring arrived with a riot of wildflowers and the first calves of the season. Esther's belly had begun to show a gentle swell that Caleb couldn't resist touching whenever they were near each other. She'd taken to wearing loose dresses. She'd sewn herself practical garments that allowed her to keep working while accommodating her changing body. The ranch prospered under their combined efforts. Caleb's cattle herd had grown substantially over the winter, and the prices for beef were strong. They'd hired 2 additional hands, young men from Bridgeport, looking for honest work, and the extra help meant Caleb could focus on expansion while Esther managed the household and finances. She'd discovered she had a head for numbers for tracking expenses and profits in the ledger Caleb had kept sporadically. Under her management, the ranch's finances became organized and efficient. She could tell Caleb exactly how much they could afford to spend on new stock, how much they needed to save for lean times, how much they could set aside for improvements. You're making me look bad, Caleb teased one evening as she worked on the books by lamplight. I've been running this place for 5 years and never managed to keep accounts this clean. That's because you were too busy actually running it, Esther pointed out. Besides, everyone has different strengths. You're better with the cattle and the land. I'm better with the details and planning. We make a good team. The best team. She set down her pen and stretched one hand, moving to the small of her back. The baby had been active all day, making its presence known with flutters and kicks that were becoming stronger as the weeks passed. Caleb noticed the gesture immediately. Backache. A little. Nothing serious. He moved behind her chair and began kneading her shoulders, working out the knots with strong, gentle hands. Esther closed her eyes and let herself relax into his touch. We need to start thinking about names, he said after a while. I've been thinking about it, Esther admitted. If it's a girl, I'd like to name her Sarah, after your sister. If that's all right with you. Caleb's hands stilled for a moment. When he spoke, his voice was thick with emotion. Sarah would have loved that. She would have loved you. And if it's a boy, I was thinking maybe Thomas, after your father. At Esther's surprised look, he added, I know he wasn't perfect. I know he hurt you, but he was still your father and he gave you life. That counts for something. Esther considered it. Her relationship with her father's memory was complicated, anger mixed with grief, resentment tangled with old love. But Caleb was right. Thomas Rayner had been flawed, broken by drink and loss, but he'd also been human. Naming a child after him felt like forgiveness, like choosing to remember the good alongside the bad. Thomas, she said softly. I like that. Sarah or Thomas Holt, Caleb said, trying out the names. Either one sounds pretty good to me. As it turned out, they wouldn't need the boy's name. Not yet, anyway. Esther went into labor on a hot July afternoon while she was in the garden pulling weeds. One moment she was fine, the next, she felt a rush of water between her legs and a contraction that nearly drove her to her knees. Caleb, she called, trying to keep the panic from her voice. Caleb, it's time. He came running from the barn, took one look at her face, and immediately shifted into calm efficiency. He helped her into the house, got her settled in their bed, then sent one of the ranch hands racing to Bridgeport to fetch the midwife. The labor was long and hard. Esther had heard other women talk about childbirth, but nothing had prepared her for the reality of it. The waves of pain that built and crested and crashed through her body. The exhaustion, the fear that something would go wrong. Through it all, Caleb stayed by her side, holding her hand, wiping her forehead with cool cloths, whispering encouragement when she was certain she couldn't continue. "You're the strongest woman I know," he told her during a brief respite between contractions. "You survived. Gaines survived a gunfight, rebuilt a ranch from ashes. You can do this." "Easy for you to say," Esther gasped. "You're not the one pushing a human being out of your body." Despite everything, he laughed. "Fair point." The midwife arrived as evening was falling, a capable woman named Mrs. Chen, who delivered half the babies in the county. She examined Esther, proclaimed that everything was progressing normally, if slowly, and settled in to wait. Sarah Grace Holt was born just after midnight, screaming her indignation at being thrust into the cold, bright world. The moment the midwife placed the baby in Esther's arms, exhausted and overwhelmed, and instantly completely in love, she understood what Caleb had meant about having a reason to live. This tiny, perfect creature with dark hair and gray eyes like her father's, this was what they'd fought for. This was what survived when violence and hatred burned themselves out. New life, new hope, a chance to build something better. Caleb touched his daughter's tiny hand with one finger, wonder written across his face. "She's beautiful," he whispered. "She's perfect." "She looks like you," Esther said, smiling through happy tears. "Poor thing." But Caleb was smiling too broader than she'd ever seen. "Welcome to the world, Sarah Grace. We're going to take such good care of you." The baby's cries quieted as she nursed for the first time, and Esther felt a peace settle over her that had nothing to do with exhaustion. Looking at her daughter, then at her husband, she marveled at the journey that had brought them all to this moment. 6 months ago, she'd been beaten in the dust, certain her life was over. Now she held new life in her arms, surrounded by love, building a future she'd never dared to dream was possible. Sometimes miracles looked like violence and fire, and standing your ground against impossible odds. And sometimes they looked like a tiny hand curling around your finger, promising forever in a grip no bigger than a whisper. The years that followed were not without challenges. There were droughts that tested their resources and harsh winters that claimed livestock. There were moments of doubt and arguments over money or direction. There were nights when Sarah cried with colic and neither parent could soothe her, when exhaustion made tempers short and patience thin. But through it all, Caleb and Esther stood together. They added that extra room to the house, then another when Thomas arrived 2 years after his sister. Then another when Emma was born, and finally a fourth when the twins Michael and Grace completed their family 5 years later. The ranch grew alongside their family. They expanded the herd, improved the bloodlines, built a reputation for quality cattle and fair dealing that brought buyers from as far as Kansas City. Tobias stayed on, becoming not just an employee, but family, a beloved uncle to all the children who taught them to ride and rope and tell the difference between a good horse and a pretty one. The scars from that night of violence faded but never quite disappeared. Sometimes Esther would wake from nightmares of being beaten in Sweetwater Creek, and Caleb would hold her until the shaking stopped. Sometimes Caleb would grow distant and haunted, lost in memories of Sarah and the men he'd killed, and Esther would pull him back to the present with gentle hands and patient love. They learned to carry their pasts without being crushed by them, to acknowledge the darkness while choosing to walk toward light. On a warm autumn evening 10 years after that terrible night, when Gaines had attacked Esther, sat on the porch watching her children play in the yard. Sarah, now 9, was teaching 6-year-old Emma how to braid wildflowers into crowns. Thomas, a serious boy of 7, helped his father repair a fence while trying to look grown-up and competent. The twins, toddling terrors at 4 years old, chased chickens with more enthusiasm than success. Caleb finished with the fence and climbed the porch steps, settling into the chair beside her with a satisfied sigh. His hair had started to gray at the temples, and there were lines around his eyes that hadn't been there when they'd met. But he was still strong, still capable, still the man who'd stepped into that street in Sweetwater Creek and changed her life forever. Happy. He asked the question he'd posed 1,000 times over the years. Esther took his hand, lacing their fingers together as she watched their children laugh and play in the golden light of sunset. The ranch spread around them, prosperous and peaceful, built from nothing by determination and love. In the distance, cattle grazed contentedly. The new barn stood solid and strong. The house behind them rang with the sounds of family and life. "I've never regretted a single step," she said, answering a question he hadn't quite asked. "Not the beating that brought us together, not the fight that nearly killed us, not the hard years or the struggles. Because every step led here to this moment, to this life we've built." "Even when I'm stubborn?" Caleb asked with a smile. "Especially then. Your stubborn streak matches mine perfectly." She squeezed his hand. "Do you remember what you said to me that day in Sweetwater Creek, when I couldn't stand? I said you'd stand with me. And I have, every day since." Esther turned to look at him fully. "But more than that, we've built something neither of us could have built alone. Not just this ranch or our family, though those things matter. We've built a life based on choosing each other every single day through good times and bad. That's what I'm proudest of. Not surviving, but thriving. Not just standing, but dancing." Caleb leaned over and kissed her, soft and sweet and familiar. "I love you, Esther Holt. I love you too, always." Young Sarah came running up to the porch, then breathless and bright-eyed. "Mama, Papa, look what Emma and I made." She held up a crown of woven wildflowers and prairie grass, crooked but beautiful. "It's lovely, sweetheart," Esther said, admiring the handiwork. "Who's it for?" "You." Sarah placed the crown carefully on her mother's head, then stepped back to admire her work. "You're the queen of the ranch." Caleb laughed. "She's right about that." "What does that make you, Papa?" Thomas asked, joining them with dirt on his hands and pride in having helped with the fence. "The lucky man who married the queen," Caleb said without hesitation. As the sun set and the children were called in for supper, Esther took one last look at the land they'd fought for, bled for, built into something remarkable. She thought about the woman she'd been broken, afraid, certain that life held nothing but more pain and hardship. And she thought about the woman she'd become, strong, loved, surrounded by family and purpose. The journey between those two versions of herself had been marked by violence and fire, by nights of terror and days of backbreaking work. But it had also been marked by love fierce enough to stand against any threat, by partnership deep enough to weather any storm, by hope stubborn enough to survive when everything said it shouldn't. She'd been beaten in the dust until she couldn't stand. But Caleb had lifted her up and promised she'd stand with him. And from that promise, they'd built a life worth living, a family worth protecting, a legacy worth passing down. Some stories end in tragedy, some end in triumph. But the best stories Esther had learned were the ones where broken people found each other in the darkness and chose to build something beautiful in the light. This was their story. This was their triumph. And as she followed her family inside, wearing a crooked crown of wildflowers and carrying 10 years of love in her heart, Esther Rayner Holt knew that every choice, every struggle, every moment of pain had been worth it to arrive at this perfect ordinary evening, surrounded by everything that mattered. She had stood with him, and together they had built a life beyond anything either of them had dared to dream. The end.